My name is Amara Bishop, and this is the story of the night I finally stopped being the family secret and became the reason they lost everything. At 18, I was the awkward, overweight disappointment sitting at the bottom of a family tree made entirely of lawyers. When I told my mother I wasn't going to law school, that I wanted to build a company instead, she packed 2 trash bags with my clothes and put them on the porch in the rain. She told me I was dead to her. She meant it literally because, for the next 10 years, that is exactly what she told everyone. 10 years later, I walked into my sister's $700,000 wedding at a private vineyard estate in Napa Valley. My mother dropped her wine glass and called me an embarrassment in front of 200 guests. My sister screamed for security to drag me out, but when the groom, a billionaire clean energy founder, rushed toward me, his face white with something that looked like fear, he didn't grab my arm to remove me. He turned on my entire family instead, and in a voice loud enough to silence the string quartet, he said, "Get your hands off her. You have no idea who this woman is." Before I tell you exactly how I brought my family's empire down to its knees, tell me where you're watching this from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button if you believe the best revenge is simply becoming someone they can no longer touch. Because what happened next in that vineyard ballroom is the kind of thing you don't forget. I need to take you back before I take you inside that ballroom, because you won't understand the size of the fall until you understand exactly how far up they thought they were standing. I was born into the Bishop name the way some people are born into a title they never asked for. My great-grandfather had been one of the first Black attorneys admitted to the Georgia bar in his era, and every generation after him had built on that legacy like it was scripture. My father argued cases in front of the state Supreme Court. My mother made partner before she turned 35, one of the youngest women, Black or white, to do it at her firm. Family dinners were not really dinners. They were cross-examinations disguised as conversation. My father quizzing us on case law between bites of pot roast. My mother correcting our grammar like we were opposing counsel in the middle of closing arguments. Simone thrived in that environment. She was 3 years older, effortlessly thin, effortlessly articulate. The kind of child who could recite the elements of a tort at 9 years old and be praised for it at every holiday gathering. I was the opposite. I was heavier than my mother thought was acceptable for a bishop daughter. My skin broke out in high school in a way hers never had. I stumbled over my words when I was nervous, and around my family, I was nervous constantly. By the time I was 16, I already knew I wasn't going to be a lawyer. I loved building things. I spent my nights teaching myself how websites worked, how small businesses scaled, how a good idea with the right structure behind it could turn into something real. My father called it a phase. My mother called it an embarrassing waste of a bishop mind. Neither of them ever asked me why I loved it. They only ever asked when I was going to grow out of it. The night everything ended, I had just gotten my LSAT score back. It wasn't a bad score. It was a perfectly respectable score, good enough for a solid law school. Which was exactly the problem. Because a solid law school wasn't going to be good enough for my mother. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with the printed score sheet in her hand and told me that a mediocre score meant a mediocre life, and that if I wasn't willing to retake it and actually apply myself, there was no point in her funding 4 more years of my education. I told her I didn't want to retake it. I told her I'd been saving money quietly for almost a year, that I had a plan to start a small online business, that I wanted to try building something that was entirely mine before I let anyone talk me into a career I didn't want. I have never seen my mother's face change that fast. It went from irritation to something colder, something almost clinical, like she was recalculating exactly how much of her life she had wasted raising a daughter who wasn't going to be useful to her image. She told me that a Black woman only earns real respect in this world with 3 letters after her name, and that my dreams of building a company were the delusional fantasies of a fat, unremarkable girl who couldn't survive real pressure. She told me my father agreed with her, and when I looked to him for anything, any small defense, he simply looked down at his newspaper and said nothing at all. That silence hurt worse than anything she said. By that night, my bags were already packed and sitting on the porch. Not by me, by her. 2 black trash bags, one filled with clothes, one filled with whatever she decided I was allowed to keep from 18 years of living in that house. It was raining, the kind of cold, relentless Georgia rain that soaks through everything in minutes. I stood on the porch in my socks, watching the porch light flicker against the water, and I asked her if she was serious. She told me I was dead to her. She said it flatly, the way she said everything in that house, like a verdict already decided before the trial even began. She shut the door before I could say anything else. I remember standing there in the rain for almost 10 minutes before I finally picked up the bags and started walking, because some small, stubborn part of me kept expecting the door to open again. It never did. I slept on a friend's couch for the first 4 months. I worked a closing shift at a coffee shop and a weekend shift stocking shelves at a grocery store, saving every spare dollar I could into a business account that started with exactly $211. I built the first version of what would eventually become Vantage Peak Capital's original portfolio company on a laptop with a cracked screen, teaching myself financial modeling from free videos at 2 a.m. because I couldn't afford the courses everyone else in the industry had access to. I remember the exact texture of those years more vividly than almost anything else in my life. The specific hum of the refrigerator in my friend's studio apartment at 3 a.m. while I worked. The particular ache in my shoulders from carrying boxes at the grocery store all day and then sitting hunched over a laptop half the night. I ate ramen so consistently that year that I still, to this day, cannot walk past the instant noodle aisle in a grocery store without a small involuntary flinch. I remember calling a customer service line once, in tears, because my prepaid phone had run out of minutes and I couldn't figure out how to add more without the $20 I didn't have that week. There was a period of about 6 weeks when I genuinely considered giving up entirely, applying to work retail full-time and quietly letting the idea of building anything die a private death where no one would ever know I'd tried and failed. What kept me going, more than ambition, more than spite, was a stubborn refusal to let the last thing I ever did be exactly what my mother predicted. I didn't need to prove I could become a lawyer. I needed to prove that her definition of success was not the only definition that existed, and that a woman who looked like me, who came from where I came from, could build something real using nothing but persistence and a library card. There were nights I genuinely wondered if my mother had been right about me. There were nights the loneliness felt like a physical weight sitting on my chest, when I would have given almost anything to hear her voice, even her cold, judgmental voice, just so I wouldn't feel so entirely erased. But I never called, because some deeply stubborn part of me had already decided that if I was going to fail, I was going to fail on my own terms. And if I was going to succeed, I wasn't going to let anyone who threw me into the rain take an ounce of credit for it. It took 6 years of failure, false starts, 2 business partners who stole from me, and 1 investor who tried to take 50% of my company for a check that barely covered payroll before anything actually worked. But something did work eventually. A small fund I started with 3 other founders who had been overlooked by every traditional venture firm in the country turned into something bigger than any of us expected. By year 8, Vantage Peak Capital wasn't just surviving. It was one of the fastest growing funds in clean technology in the country, and I was signing checks large enough to keep entire companies alive. There was one person who saw something in me during those early years that no one in my family ever bothered to look for. Her name was Colette Reyes, a retired investment banker who used to come into the coffee shop where I worked every morning, always ordering the same black coffee, always reading something dense and financial on a battered tablet. We started talking during slow shifts, mostly about nothing, until one day she asked what I would build if money were never a barrier. I told her about the idea I'd been quietly developing for over a year, a fund structured specifically to find promising founders that traditional venture capital overlooked because they didn't come from the right schools or the right networks. She listened for almost 20 minutes without interrupting, and then she told me something I have never forgotten. She said the biggest mistake people make when they're trying to prove someone wrong is building a life that's designed around the argument instead of around the actual work. She told me to stop thinking about my mother entirely, to build the fund because it was a genuinely good idea, not because it was a rebuttal. Colette became my first true mentor, and eventually my first institutional investor, writing a modest check that, in retrospect, meant far more than its dollar amount, because it was the first time in my adult life that someone had looked at my work and decided it deserved real belief instead of charity. She passed away 3 years before that wedding, quietly, in her sleep, and I still keep a framed photo of the 2 of us on my office wall, right next to the framed yearbook mock-up my mother once laughed at. I never told my family any of it. I never sent an email, never posted anything that could trace back to me, because I understood something about them that took me years to fully accept. If they had known I was successful while I was still building it, they would have found a way to insert themselves into the story, to claim my resilience as evidence of their tough love, to parade me around every gala as proof that their parenting method worked exactly as intended. I wasn't going to give them that. I decided a long time ago that if we were ever going to meet again, it would be entirely on my terms, in a room full of witnesses, at a moment they could never spin into anything that benefited them. I want to tell you about one specific memory before we go any further, because it explains more about that night than almost anything else I could describe. I was 15. Simone was 18, already accepted into an accelerated pre-law program, already treated like royalty at every family function. I had joined the school's yearbook committee that year, the first thing I had ever chosen entirely for myself, something that had nothing to do with grades or law school applications. I spent weeks designing a layout I was genuinely proud of. Simone found the mock-up on the kitchen counter one evening and brought it to dinner, holding it up in front of our parents like evidence in a trial. She read the captions out loud in a mocking voice, pointed out a small formatting error on the sports section, and told our mother, in front of both of them, that it was embarrassing I was wasting my time on something so beneath the family name instead of studying for the SAT. My mother laughed. Not a small laugh. A real one, the kind she rarely gave anyone, and she agreed with Simone that my time would be better spent on something that actually mattered. I sat there and watched them dismantle the one thing I had built entirely on my own, and I remember thinking, with a strange, cold clarity for a 15-year-old, that nothing I ever created in that house would be allowed to exist without their permission. Simone did that constantly, quietly, in ways too small to ever be called out directly, but large enough to leave permanent marks. She would casually mention my weight in front of boys I liked. She would accidentally leave my acne medication out on the bathroom counter when friends came over. She built her entire adolescent identity on being effortlessly superior to me, and our parents rewarded her for it every single time, because in their eyes, tearing me down was simply confirmation that their golden child had been right about her own excellence all along. By the time I was 18, I had absorbed so much of what they told me that I genuinely believed I was the problem. It took years of therapy, years of quietly rebuilding a version of myself that didn't depend on their approval, to understand that none of it had ever actually been about me. It was about their need for a hierarchy, a clear system of who mattered and who didn't. Because a family that measures its own worth entirely by external validation always needs someone at the bottom to compare themselves against. That moment finally arrived on a warm September afternoon, in the form of a wedding invitation I was never sent, for a sister I hadn't spoken to in a decade, at an estate I happened to own. The late afternoon sun poured gold over the rolling hills of Sonoma, the kind of light that makes everything look like a movie set. Chateau Belle Rose sat at the top of the property like a crown, all creamy limestone and arched windows, the kind of estate that photographs beautifully for a wedding, but costs more per night than most people make in a year. Rows of grapevines stretched out behind the main hall in perfect green lines, and somewhere beyond them the coastal breeze carried the smell of jasmine and money. I had arrived at the estate 3 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, technically as its new owner, though almost no one on site that day knew it yet. I walked the property alone that morning, past the small chapel where the vows were supposed to take place, past the tented reception area where staff were still arranging place settings, past the cellar where a sommelier was uncorking bottles worth more than most people's monthly rent. I remember standing at the edge of the vineyard, looking out over the neat rows of vines catching the early light, thinking about how strange it was that the last time I'd stood on my family's property, it had been raining, and I had been carrying everything I owned in 2 garbage bags. I had given the general manager, Gerald, strict instructions weeks earlier as part of the acquisition. He was to proceed with the wedding exactly as planned, to say absolutely nothing to my mother about the change in ownership, and to alert me the moment the final invoice was due. I wanted her to have her perfect day, right up until the exact second reality was scheduled to arrive. By the time I changed into the jumpsuit I'd chosen weeks earlier for this exact purpose, something structured enough to command a room without announcing wealth too loudly, the first guests were already arriving, filing into the grand hall in designer gowns and custom tuxedos, none of them aware that the ground beneath the entire event had already shifted hours earlier. Inside the grand hall, it was a performance of wealth so precise it bordered on theater. Thousands of white peonies, draped ivory silk hanging from a ceiling of exposed wooden beams, a 12-piece orchestra tucked into the corner, playing something classical and forgettable. The guest list read like a legal directory of the entire Southeast. Federal judges, managing partners from the biggest firms in Atlanta, state senators who owed my father favors, and enough old money to build a small country. My family had always measured a person's worth in exactly 2 currencies: the letters after their name and the size of the room they could fill with people who feared them. Tonight, the room was full. At the center of it, holding court beside an ice sculpture shaped like a rising phoenix, was my mother, Deborah Bishop. She wore deep emerald silk that probably cost more than my first apartment. Her hair swept into the kind of controlled elegance that took a stylist 2 hours to make look effortless. She was laughing with the managing partner of one of the largest firms in the state, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, every gesture calibrated for an audience. She looked exactly like I remembered her. Immaculate, terrifying, entirely constructed for other people's approval. I smoothed the front of my charcoal silk jumpsuit, tailored to fit exactly right, quiet in a way that only someone who understood real money would recognize. No logos, no flash. Just fabric that moved like water and cost more than most cars. I took a breath, and I walked into the ballroom. I didn't slip in through a side door. I didn't hide behind a pillar and wait for the right moment. I walked straight up the center aisle, letting the click of my heels against the reclaimed hardwood floor announce me the way nothing else could. I kept my chin level, my shoulders back, my face unreadable. I was not the terrified, humiliated 18-year-old they had thrown into the rain. That version of me had died out on that porch a decade ago, and something else had been built in her place. It took my mother exactly 30 seconds to see me. She had been mid-laugh, mid-sentence, her lips still curved in that plastic smile, when her eyes crossed the room and locked onto mine. The stem of her wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor, red wine spreading across the pale wood like a wound. The sound cut through every conversation near her. Heads turned. Several guests actually stepped back, as if the mess itself was contagious. I didn't stop walking until I was standing 3 feet away from the woman who gave birth to me. "What in God's name are you doing here?" she hissed. Her voice was pitched low, controlled, calibrated to avoid a scene, but the venom underneath it was unmistakable. She stepped toward me, crunching broken glass under her heel without so much as glancing down. "You ungrateful, useless disgrace. Get out before I have you removed." Her eyes raked over my outfit, searching for cracks, for the frayed hem or the discount fabric she expected to find. She wanted evidence that I had failed exactly the way she predicted. I let her look. I stood perfectly still and met her fury with a calm, easy smile. "Hello, Mother," I said. "You look well." The breeze coming through the open terrace doors smelled like lavender and cut grass, a strange contrast to the cold radiating off the woman in front of me. "Don't call me that," she snapped, closing the last of the distance between us. Her eyes darted sideways, checking who was watching. 10 years ago, when you decided to throw away a full ride to law school to chase some ridiculous fantasy about starting a company, you ended any claim you had to this family. We are builders of legacies, Amara. We argue cases that change the law of this state, and you chose to become a nobody so you could avoid the discipline of an actual career. I looked at the woman who raised me and felt nothing. No fear, no desperate need for her approval, just a strange, clean quiet. I remembered the exact weight of the trash bag she'd packed for me. I remembered her voice cracking through the screen door, telling me a Black woman only earns respect in this world with 3 letters after her name, J.D., and that my dreams of building something on my own were the delusions of a lazy girl who couldn't hack real pressure. She'd handed me $40 and told me never to set foot on her street again. She had wanted me to fail. She needed me to fail, because my failure would have proven she was right about everything. Standing there in that ballroom, watching her hands shake around the stem of a glass that no longer existed, I understood that I had already won a long time ago. "You have some nerve showing up here," she continued, her voice trembling with restrained rage. "We told everyone you died. Do you understand what you're risking by walking in here? We had to grieve you in front of the entire Georgia Bar Association. Do you have any idea what it cost us, socially, to explain a daughter who dropped out instead of finishing her degree? People sent flowers, Amara. I had to sit through a memorial luncheon that your father's partners organized because the alternative was telling them the truth. Now get out before you ruin Simone's day. I let the words wash over me without leaving a mark. It was almost sad how small her entire world actually was. A life built entirely around reputation and billable hours and the opinions of people who would abandon her the second it became inconvenient to know her. She thought I had come to beg. She thought I had come to make a scene out of jealousy. She had absolutely no idea that I had come to take everything. A waiter passed with a tray of sparkling water, and I reached out, lifted a glass with unhurried grace, and took a slow sip while holding my mother's gaze. "I came for a wedding," I said lightly. "Doesn't this family always preach about grace and forgiveness at the pulpit on Sundays?" Before I go further, understand this. I did not walk into that ballroom on a whim. I had spent the previous 18 months quietly assembling a team of forensic accountants, corporate attorneys, and a former federal investigator turned private consultant, all working under strict non-disclosure agreements to understand exactly how deep my family's finances had actually decayed underneath the surface they showed the world. I had followed the wire transfers. I had traced the shell companies. I knew about the foundation before I ever bought a plane ticket to California. Everything that happened in that ballroom that evening had already been decided weeks earlier. I was simply the one holding the detonator. A few feet away, I noticed one of my mother's oldest friends, a family court judge named Marlene Ashworth, staring at me with narrowed, calculating eyes, clearly trying to place my face against a decade-old memory. She had known me since I was a child, back when I still tried desperately to earn a smile from my mother at every one of her dinner parties. "Amara," she said slowly, stepping toward me before my mother even noticed I was in the room. "Is that really you? We were told that I died in a car accident," I finished for her, offering a calm, polite smile. "I know. It's a wonderful story. I'd love for you to hear the real one before the night is over." Marlene's face shifted from confusion to something more suspicious, the practiced instinct of a woman who had spent 30 years on the bench learning to smell a lie before it finished forming. She said nothing else, but I noticed her drifting toward the edge of the crowd, watching, waiting, exactly the kind of witness I needed in that room. I thought it was time for a family reunion. The sharp clatter of heels against hardwood cut through whatever tension had settled around us. The crowd of judges and senior partners parted like a courtroom clearing for a verdict, and through the gap came the bride herself. My older sister, Simone, marched toward me with a face contorted into something no amount of professional contouring could hide. Her wedding gown, layers of ivory tulle and delicate French lace, whipped violently around her legs with every furious step. "You are not invited!" she shrieked, all the polished elegance she'd been performing all evening for her new in-laws completely gone. She closed the last few feet between us and thrust her hand toward my face, a massive emerald-cut diamond catching the chandelier light an inch from my nose. "Get out of my wedding! You have no right to be here. You're still the same fat, insecure failure who couldn't hack law school and drag this family's name through the mud. I left you behind a long time ago, and you are not going to ruin the most important day of my life." I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I looked at the trembling hand pointed at my face, and then slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. Simone was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling against the boning of her bodice, so consumed by the memory of the scared, overweight girl I used to be that she couldn't process the woman standing calmly in front of her now. "I know exactly why you crawled in here," she continued, her voice climbing in pitch, drawing uncomfortable glances from nearby guests. "You heard I was marrying into the Whitfield family. You saw the coverage about Nathaniel's company and his family's money, and you thought you could show up out of whatever gutter you've been living in and beg for a handout. Well, it's not happening. My husband's family isn't a charity for broke dropouts. You will not get a single cent from him." The sheer projection in her words was almost beautiful in its desperation. She was so terrified of losing her grip on the Whitfield fortune that she assumed everyone around her wanted the exact same thing she did. She wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone, to shove me back into the role of family scapegoat I'd been assigned since childhood. She expected tears. She expected me to shrink. Instead, I let out a soft, genuinely amused laugh. I took a single deliberate step forward, close enough that only she and the ring of gossiping relatives near her could hear me. "You look very tense for a bride," I said, keeping my tone light. "Although I suppose I would be too, if I were squeezed into a dress that clearly wasn't made for my measurements." Simone gasped, her free hand flying to her chest. "How dare you! This is a custom gown!" "Is it?" I tilted my head, feigning innocent curiosity. "Because from where I'm standing, that's last season's Galia Lahav sample line, and the stitching along your left side seam has been let out twice. Rental houses do that when they need to fit the dress to whoever's paying that week." Simone froze. The blood drained out of her contoured cheeks, leaving her looking almost gray under the warm lighting. I leaned in a fraction closer, delivering the next line with surgical precision. "Tell me something, counselor. For a woman who constantly brags about making partner 2 years early, why is she wearing a rental gown to marry into a family worth 9 figures? Is the salary not quite what you tell everyone at the country club?" A cluster of bridesmaids standing near the cake table had gone very still, their champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips. I recognized one of them, a woman named Priya who had gone to law school with Simone, and I watched her lean toward the woman beside her and whisper something behind a cupped hand. Word was already starting to move through the room, the way it always does at events like this, quiet and fast, like water finding the lowest point in a floor. "She's just jealous," Simone announced loudly, turning toward the bridesmaids for support, her voice pitching higher and more theatrical, clearly hoping an audience would shame me into silence. "This is my sister, the one who couldn't cut it in school. She's been off doing God knows what for 10 years, and now she shows up at my wedding trying to embarrass me because she has nothing else going on in her sad little life." The bridesmaids exchanged uncertain glances, none of them quite willing to commit to either side yet. In this world, you never picked a losing team too early. The silence that followed was deafening. The guests nearby, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, exchanged wide, calculating glances. In my family's world, appearance was currency, and being exposed for wearing a rented dress at a $700,000 wedding was social suicide. "Shut up," Simone hissed, her eyes darting frantically toward the entrance, checking whether Nathaniel or his parents were within earshot. "You don't know anything about my finances or my practice." But I did know. I knew exactly how deep the rot in her perfect life truly ran. I just wasn't ready to show her the full autopsy yet. I wanted her to sweat first. I wanted her to feel 1/10 of the public humiliation she and my mother had made me swallow every single day of my adolescence. I don't need to lie, Simone, I said, stepping back but keeping my posture entirely dominant. The seams speak for themselves. You spent your whole life making sure everyone thought you were superior to me. You mocked my weight, my skin, my dreams, while Mom tore apart what was left of my self-esteem. And now look at you, sweating through a rental gown, terrified your new husband is going to figure out you're performing a lifestyle you can't actually afford. Simone's hand curled into something close to a claw, and for one terrifying second I thought she might actually swing at me. You're a monster, she breathed, chest heaving. I will not let you ruin this. Security! Someone get security in here right now! Get this woman out of my sight and throw her out on the road where she belongs. The heavy double doors at the back of the hall swung open before her voice even finished echoing. But it wasn't only hotel security marching through. Leading the group was a tall, broad figure whose presence alone seemed to command the whole room into silence. My father, Charles Bishop. He moved with the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who had spent 30 years cross-examining people into ruin for a living. The crowd of judges and senior partners parted for him instantly, holding their breath the way juries do before a verdict. He looked like he was ready to have someone arrested. He stepped directly between Simone and me, his shoulders blocking my view of my trembling sister. He leaned in close enough that I could smell the sharp cedar of his cologne. He didn't yell. He never needed to. His voice was a low, lethal whisper, designed to cut through me without alerting the guests standing 10 feet away. You are not going to do this, he said, eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. You will not embarrass this family in front of the Whitfields. I stared back at the man who was supposed to protect me when I was a struggling teenager sleeping on a friend's couch. Embarrass you, I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. By simply existing in the same room as your very important guests? He stepped even closer, forcing me to tilt my chin up to hold eye contact. We told the Whitfields you died in a car accident on I-75 10 years ago. We had to. How else were we supposed to explain a daughter who threw away a full ride to a top 10 law school to chase some fantasy? We buried your memory so your sister could have a future. Do not think for 1 second I will let you resurrect yourself just to sabotage her wedding. The sheer audacity of it took my breath away, even though I'd already known. They hadn't just disowned me. They had literally killed me off, accepted casseroles and condolence cards from partners and clients, all to avoid the unbearable shame of admitting their daughter had chosen a different path. It was sick. It was calculated. And it was exactly the kind of image management I expected from a man who built his entire identity on winning. I smiled, letting my amusement show. That sounds like a significant liability for a managing partner. What happens when the groom finds out his bride's family fabricated a death certificate? He's never going to find out, my father said. And then he signaled 2 hotel security guards flanking him. They stepped forward, faces blank. Remove this trespasser through the service entrance. If she makes a single sound, call the police and press charges for criminal trespass. I want her gone before Nathaniel or his parents notice. I glanced past his shoulder for a moment, taking in the room the way I imagine a general takes in a battlefield before committing to a strategy. I could see the caterers frozen mid-step near the kitchen doors, trays balanced awkwardly in their hands, unsure whether to keep serving or retreat. I could see a cluster of my mother's hospital-adjacent friends, the ones who had cried actual tears at my fake memorial a decade earlier, now whispering behind champagne flutes, already reshaping the story in real time to protect themselves from whatever came next. I could see Simone's new mother-in-law standing rigid near the head table, her hand pressed to her chest, watching her son's future collapse in slow motion. Every single person in that room was a witness I had spent months planning for, and not one of them yet understood the role they were about to play. The guards moved toward me, hands reaching for my arms. I took a slow step to the side, slipping just out of their reach. I locked eyes with my father, holding a stillness that made him freeze in place. "Let him speak, Dad," I said quietly, and somehow the words carried across the entire silenced ballroom. Every whispering conversation stopped. I shifted my gaze past my father, toward the groom, standing frozen near the head table, his expression a mixture of confusion and something else, something that looked almost like recognition. "I believe there's something Nathaniel wanted to say before you interrupted him," I said, offering the groom a polite, professional nod. "Go ahead, Nathaniel. Tell my father exactly who his dead daughter really is." Simone let out a short, mocking laugh, a desperate attempt to reclaim her audience. "Tell us what? That you somehow tricked your way into meeting him before today? Nathaniel, don't let her play games with you. She's a broke nobody. She doesn't even have a law degree." Nathaniel Whitfield looked at his bride with an expression of pure disbelief, and something underneath it that looked dangerously close to disgust. He took a slow breath, straightened his shoulders, and adjusted the lapel of his tuxedo. When he spoke, his voice carried clear and loud across the vaulted ceiling of the hall, ensuring every judge, every senior partner, and every relative in that room heard exactly what came next. "This woman is Amara Bishop," he said. "She is the founder and managing partner of Vantage Peak Capital." He let the words settle for a moment, letting the weight of the name land across the crowd. I watched recognition flash through the eyes of several venture-adjacent guests standing near the bar. Vantage Peak Capital wasn't just another investment firm. In clean energy and infrastructure, it was one of the few funds capable of writing 9-figure checks without blinking. Nathaniel turned his body, angling himself away from Simone and fully toward me, a gesture that read like a bow. "Let me tell you exactly how I know that name," he continued, addressing the entire room, his voice steady despite the visible tremor of anger underneath it. 2 years ago, I was an engineer with a garage full of prototype batteries and a spreadsheet full of debt. Every fund in Silicon Valley told me clean energy storage was too capital intensive, too risky, too far from profitable to bother with. I nearly shut the company down twice. Then, an anonymous investment vehicle called Vantage Peak Capital reached out through my lead scientist network and asked for a meeting. He paused, glancing at me with something between gratitude and disbelief, as if he were still recalculating the version of me standing in front of him against the faceless signature he had only ever seen on legal documents. "I never met the person behind that fund," he continued. "Every negotiation happened through attorneys and a single encrypted line of communication. My team used to joke that our mystery investor was probably some reclusive old man in a mountain cabin somewhere. I never once imagined it was a woman my own bride's family had told me was dead." "She is the anonymous investor who saved my company," he continued, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and residual anger. 8 months ago, when a coordinated patent lawsuit nearly killed my Series C round and 3 other funds pulled out overnight, it was Amara Bishop who personally wired $45 million to keep Solvia's battery labs running. She owns 30% of the company I built. Every job we've created, every clean energy project we've powered, exists because this woman believed in something everyone else walked away from. The collective gasp from the crowd sounded like the room itself had lost its air. I watched my mother take a physical step backward, her heels wobbling on the hardwood. The color drained from her face entirely, leaving her looking hollow, almost aged in the amber light. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. The psychological blow was almost visible, rippling across her features in real time. For a woman whose entire identity was built on the superiority of a law degree, the realization was apocalyptic. The daughter she'd thrown into the rain for refusing to sit for the LSAT was now sitting on top of the capital that fueled the industries her entire circle depended on. Beside her, my father looked like he'd been struck by lightning. His broad chest deflated, his commanding posture collapsing into something small. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, suddenly aware that the security guards he'd just ordered to physically remove me had nearly laid hands on one of the most influential investors in the country. But Simone couldn't process it. Her entire reality was too fragile, too dependent on being the golden child to accept the truth standing calmly in front of her. "No!" she shouted, voice cracking, breaking the stunned silence. "That's a lie, Nathaniel! You're being scammed! She's a college dropout. She couldn't even pass the LSAT 10 years ago. She locked herself in her room crying because she was too stupid to understand basic logic games." She pointed a shaking finger at my chest, rings rattling. "Look at her! She's a fraud! Mom threw her out with $40 to her name. How does a fat failure with no degree end up with $45 million? She must have stolen it. She's probably some sugar baby sleeping with a decrepit old billionaire who lets her play with his checkbook. Nathaniel, you need to call the police before she drains your accounts too." The sheer ignorance in her accusation almost made me laugh out loud. I didn't need to defend my wealth, but Nathaniel was visibly furious on my behalf. "Are you actually out of your mind?" he demanded, voice sharp with disgust. "Do you have any idea how private equity works? A $45 million capital injection requires months of due diligence, SEC clearance, a team of corporate attorneys, forensic accountants combing through every line of the cap table. Amara didn't hand me a personal check. She structured a legal, audited, board-approved investment that saved 400 jobs. And you have the audacity to stand there in a rented dress and call a self-made investor a thief." Simone flinched, recoiling from the force of his words. She looked around the room, desperately searching for allies. Her law school sorority sisters, her father's junior partners, the judges who owed her family favors. No one met her eyes. The crowd was too busy staring at me with a newfound, calculating reverence. In this world, money spoke louder than any objection ever could, and right now, I was the loudest voice in the room. I decided it was time to step further into the conversation. I moved slowly toward my mother, who was still trembling beside my father. "You look surprised, Mother," I said, keeping my voice smooth. "I'm not sure why. You always told me the only way to earn respect was to become a lawyer. You said business was a game for people too undisciplined to argue real cases. You told me I'd end up begging on the street." My mother swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly. "Amara," she whispered, "we didn't know. We had no idea You had no idea I was successful," I finished for her. "Because if you'd known, you'd have paraded me around every gala in Atlanta, taking credit for my ambition. You would have told everyone your tough love built my empire. But you didn't know, So instead, you erased me to protect your fragile ego.
My father tried to salvage what was left of the moment, stepping forward with both hands raised in a placating gesture I recognized from every courtroom closing argument he'd ever rehearsed at our dinner table.
Amara, please. This is a shock to all of us. You have to understand, from our perspective, you disappeared. We grieved you. If you had just called and told us you'd started something.
I let out a soft, cold laugh that cut his excuse dead in the water.
I didn't disappear, Dad. You changed the locks. Mom blocked my number. You told your partners to ignore my emails when I asked for a small business loan to get off the ground. You wanted me to fail, so you could prove that walking away from the family firm was a fatal mistake. You want to talk about defect, I said, turning back to my mother before addressing my sister, letting the memory surface for the first time in years. Do you remember the yearbook I made in 10th grade, Mother? The one you and Simone laughed about at the dinner table because you thought it was embarrassing that I cared about something that wasn't a grade point average? I still have that mock-up. I framed it and put it on the wall of my very first office because I wanted to remember exactly what it felt like the day I decided your opinion of what mattered would never again decide what I was allowed to build. My mother's jaw tightened, some flicker of recognition passing behind her eyes, the specific discomfort of being reminded of a cruelty small enough that she had genuinely forgotten it, while I had carried it for over a decade. You have always been dramatic, she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. Children say things. It didn't mean anything. It meant everything, I said quietly. That's the part you never understood. Every small thing you dismissed as nothing built the exact woman standing in front of you right now. You didn't break me by throwing me out in the rain. You broke me 1,000 small times before that, and every single time I got back up anyway. I turned my attention back to my sister, who was hyperventilating, clutching the fabric of her rented gown like armor. And you, Simone, I said, my voice dropping into something quieter, more dangerous. You spent your entire life stepping on my neck to make yourself look taller. You mocked my weight, my skin, my dreams, while watching Mom systematically destroy my confidence. You thought passing the bar made you untouchable. Tell me, dear sister, how does it feel knowing the brilliant husband you're trying to marry into old money with essentially works for me? Simone let out a choked sob, hands flying up to cover her face. Nathaniel looked at her with an expression of pure revulsion, realizing the compassionate, driven partner he thought he was marrying wasn't real. She was a vicious, insecure woman who had actively participated in erasing her own sister. The entire hierarchy of my family had just collapsed in a matter of minutes. The untouchable matriarch was speechless. The powerful patriarch was terrified. And the golden child was sobbing in front of 200 witnesses, watching her fairy tale collide with a truth she could not afford to survive. Simone's brain seemed to short-circuit under the weight of it. Her sobbing cut off abruptly, replaced by sharp, frantic breathing that made the silk of her gown heave. She smeared her waterproof mascara, wiping her face, and stepped away from Nathaniel, circling me like a trapped animal, heels clicking erratically against the hardwood. "It's a lie!" she shrieked, voice cracking as it bounced off the exposed beams overhead. "It's a complete lie, and you're all fools if you believe a single word out of her mouth." She jabbed her diamond-clad finger toward my chest, rings rattling against each other. "I know who she really is. She's a fraud. A dropout who couldn't handle basic logic. She has no degree, no pedigree. There's no way a broke failure built an investment firm on her own." She spun to grab Nathaniel's arm with an iron grip. "Nathaniel, listen to me. You're brilliant, but you're being conned. She doesn't have $45 million of her own money. She's probably a front for some illegal operation. Or worse, she's laundering someone else's dirty money through your company." The vulgarity of her accusations made several older women nearby gasp and clutch their pearls. My family's world thrived on discretion and polish, and here was the bride shrieking about laundering and sugar daddies in the middle of her own reception. Nathaniel looked at her with a mixture of shock and disgust, prying her fingers off his jacket like she was contagious. "Simone, you're losing your mind," he said, voice low and dangerous. "Do you even hear the words coming out of your mouth?" I held up a hand, signaling that I didn't need him to fight this particular battle. "A front for laundering," I repeated, letting a soft, amused laugh escape. "That's a creative theory, Simone. But let's talk about the reality of private capital for a second. Do you think a wealthy man simply hands his corporate account to a mistress so she can lead a Series C round for a battery technology company?" I took a slow step toward her, backing her against the edge of a floral arrangement. The $45 million wired into Solvia was cleared by the SEC. The disbursement documents carry my signature. The anti-money laundering filings, the board approvals, the tax filings, all of it has my name on it. I built Vantage Peak Capital from a card table in a studio apartment, working 3 jobs while I taught myself how venture financing actually worked. I did not inherit a cent, and I certainly didn't sleep my way into a signature line. I lowered my voice just enough to force the gossiping partners and their wives to lean in. "But since we're on the topic of using your position to get ahead, let's talk about your bar exam, Simone." The sudden shift made her freeze. The manic energy drained instantly, replaced by a raw, visceral fear. Her eyes darted toward our mother, who stepped forward as if to intervene, but I didn't give either of them the chance to stop what was already moving. "You love bragging about passing on your first attempt," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "You love looking down on anyone who took longer than you did. But tell me, dear sister, how does a student who failed the bar twice suddenly pass on the 3rd attempt with the highest score in her cohort, right after the chief examiner for the state board started showing up at family dinners?" Simone's throat clicked audibly. "Shut up," she whispered, a plea I had no intention of honoring. "Did you really think that would stay buried forever?" I asked, tilting my head. "Did you think no one knew about the married state examiner who mysteriously flagged your exam for a rare hand review and just so happened to overturn your failing score? Should we tell your brilliant new husband about the weekend trips to that boutique hotel in Buckhead? Should we talk about the payment Mom quietly wired his wife when she found out and threatened to report you both to the bar's ethics board?" The gasp that ripped through the crowd was deafening. Judges who'd been sipping champagne went rigid. Senior partners exchanged horrified glances. In this world, academic fraud tangled up with an affair involving a state official was the kind of scandal that ended careers overnight. I reached into my clutch again, retrieving my phone, and turned the screen toward the crowd just long enough for the nearest guests to see the header of a printed email chain I had photographed months earlier. "I have copies of the emails between the chief examiner's office and Mom's private account, discussing the wire transfer to his wife in exchange for her silence. I have the hotel receipts from the Ashford Suites in Buckhead, 6 separate weekends, all charged to a corporate card registered under a shell entity called Meridian Consulting Group, which, funnily enough, does not appear to consult on anything at all." Marlene Ashworth, the judge I'd spoken to earlier, had gone pale near the back of the crowd, her hand pressed flat against her chest. She was, I would later learn, one of only 2 people on the State Bar's disciplinary board who had signed off on Simone's late review request, a decision she would spend the following year explaining under oath. "You're a liar!" Simone screamed, tears streaming down her face, ruining what was left of her makeup. She turned to Nathaniel, who had already taken 3 steps back, hands covering his mouth. "Nathaniel, she's making this up to destroy me. She's jealous. She's always been jealous of my success." She didn't need to say anything else. The panic radiating off her body and the way our father suddenly stared at the floor in shame told the crowd everything they needed to know. The golden child of the Bishop family, the polished, brilliant attorney everyone had worshipped, was a fraud who had compromised every ethical boundary to get her license. Simone's bridesmaids had gone quiet near the cake table, no longer whispering behind cupped hands, but simply staring. The way people stare at a car accident they cannot look away from. One of them, Priya, the woman I'd noticed earlier, actually took a small step away from Simone, putting visible distance between herself and the collapsing bride, as if proximity itself might now be professionally dangerous. "You spent our entire childhood telling me I was going to end up nothing," I continued, turning back to my sister. "You used to tell me at every family dinner that at least you'd never have to worry about competing with me for anything, because I wasn't competition. Do you remember that? You said it so casually, like it wasn't even an insult. Just a fact everyone in the room already agreed on. I used to go up to my room after those dinners and cry into my pillow so no one would hear me. And you knew that. You knew exactly how much it hurt, and you kept doing it anyway, because it made you feel bigger." Simone's face crumpled, the last of her composure finally breaking entirely. "I was a kid too," she said, voice small in a way I hadn't heard from her since we were actually children. "Mom and Dad put so much pressure on me to be perfect. I thought if I made you smaller, it would make the pressure on me smaller too." "Maybe that's true," I said, and for the first time all evening, my voice softened slightly, not with forgiveness, but with something closer to recognition. "But you were still the one holding the knife, Simone, even if someone handed it to you first." Nathaniel looked at his bride, breathing hard, as if he'd just run a mile. He shook his head slowly, eyes wide with a horrible realization settling into place. "Every time I asked you about law school," he said quietly, "you told me it was hard work and discipline. You made me feel small for not understanding the sacrifice. And the entire time, you were sleeping with a man twice your age to fix your grades." "It's not what it sounds like," Simone said, her voice breaking apart entirely. "Then what does it sound like?" Nathaniel snapped. "Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like everything about you has been a performance." My mother finally found her voice, though it came out thin and brittle. "This is exactly why we told everyone you died, Amara. You have always had this gift for destruction. You cannot simply let people enjoy their happiness. You have to burn everything down." I turned to look at her, letting the silence stretch a moment before I answered. "You want to talk about legacy?" I said. "Let's actually talk about it. Great-grandfather Bishop fought to sit for the Georgia bar exam in a courthouse that didn't even have a bathroom he was allowed to use. He built something real, out of nothing, against odds neither of us will ever fully understand. And you took that name, that actual legacy, and turned it into a brand you used to steal from children who needed help exactly the way he once did. You didn't protect his legacy tonight, Mother. You buried it under a shell company in Delaware." My mother's face went through something complicated. Anger and shame fighting for the same real estate. "You have no right to invoke his name," she said, her voice shaking. "You walked away from everything he built." "No," I said. "I walked away from what you turned it into. There's a difference. And somewhere underneath all of this, I think you know exactly what it is." "I'm not destroying anything, Mother. I'm just standing here, telling the truth in a room you built entirely out of lies. If the truth destroys this family, it's because the foundation was rotten long before I walked through that door." At that exact moment, a man in a dark navy suit approached from the direction of the estate's main office, moving with the brisk, uncomfortable urgency of someone about to deliver terrible news. He wore a small gold pin on his lapel that read, "Chateau Belrose, General Manager." "Mrs. Bishop," he said, clearing his throat as he reached my mother. "I apologize for interrupting, but we have an urgent matter regarding the final payment for tonight's event." My mother waved a dismissive hand, still visibly rattled. "Not now, Gerald. We'll sort out the invoice on Monday like we always do." "I'm afraid that's not possible," he said, his voice tightening. "The card on file for the remaining balance, $712,000, was declined twice this afternoon. I attempted to reach your office, but I was informed the account is significantly overdrawn." The color that had barely returned to my mother's face drained out again completely. "That's absurd," she snapped, glancing around to see who was listening. "There must be some kind of banking error. Try the card again." "I did," Gerald said, and something about his tone made the entire nearby crowd go quiet, sensing blood in the water. "I was also informed that this property is currently under new ownership. As of 8 o'clock this morning, Chateau Belrose was acquired in a full cash transaction. The new parent company is Vantage Peak Capital." He turned toward me, offering a small, respectful nod. "Ms. Bishop is the sole owner of this estate. Every room, every vineyard acre, this entire hall belongs to her. My staff and I now work for her directly. I cannot remove her from her own property, but she is well within her rights to ask any of you to leave." The reaction rippled through the crowd instantly, devastating and total. Whispers surged like a wave, the words declined and overdrawn, passing from table to table. The pristine, flawless image the Bishop family had spent decades constructing dissolved in real time. My mother looked frantically around the room, catching the eyes of the same judges and senior partners she'd spent years cultivating. They were all staring back at her now with a mixture of pity and open disgust. In their world, financial ruin was one thing. Being exposed publicly for it, at your own daughter's wedding, was unforgivable. I stepped forward, heels clicking sharply against the hardwood, letting every syllable land with precision. $700,000 to rent a venue you couldn't afford, I said, shaking my head slowly. Did you really think you could keep the charade going forever? You've been walking around tonight in silk, acting like royalty, while your firm's accounts have been bleeding out for months. Your credit lines have been maxed since last winter. You've been shuffling debt from one account to another, just to keep the lights on in that mansion you love showing off. Shut your mouth! My mother shrieked, lunging forward before my father caught her arm and pulled her back, his own face pale with sweat. You wanted an audience tonight, I continued, keeping my gaze locked on her. You invited every important person you know to witness your triumph. So let them witness the truth instead. You are broke. You took out a second mortgage on the house just to cover the deposit for this wedding. You leveraged everything you own to throw a party you couldn't afford. Also, Simone could marry into money you desperately needed. I turned to Nathaniel, who was staring at my family with an expression of pure, unfiltered horror. "And why did they do it?" I asked, gesturing toward Simone, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. "Because your future wife was never going to earn enough on her own to sustain the lifestyle she was raised to expect. They saw your family's name, your generational wealth, your spotless reputation, and they decided you were the perfect financial lifeline for a family that was quietly drowning. They convinced you that you were marrying into a stable legal dynasty, when in reality, you were marrying into debt and desperation dressed up in silk." "That's not true!" Simone cried, stepping toward Nathaniel with her hands outstretched, dragging the heavy hem of her rented dress across the floor. "My parents have money! It's just a temporary cash flow problem because of some bad investments. We're not using you. I love you. Please believe me." Nathaniel stepped back sharply, treating her like she carried something contagious. "Don't touch me," he said, voice shaking with cold fury. "A temporary cash flow problem? Your mother's credit card just bounced at our own wedding. Your family secretly mortgaged their house to throw a party designed to impress mine. You lied to me about your sister dying. You lied to me about your finances. What else have you lied about, Simone? Is anything about you real?" Nathaniel's mother, Eleanor Whitfield, a soft-spoken woman who had inherited her own family's shipping fortune and had spent decades quietly funding literacy programs across the Bay Area without ever putting her name on a building, approached me later that evening as the crowd thinned, once the initial shock had settled into something more like exhausted disbelief. "I want you to know," she said, taking my hand gently, "that I recognized something in you the moment you walked into that hall. Real composure isn't loud. It's exactly what you had standing there. And I don't think anyone in that room, including my own son, fully understood what they were witnessing until it was already finished." "Thank you," I said, genuinely moved by the gesture, especially given how badly the evening had gone for everyone involved. "I'm sorry your family got caught up in the middle of it." "Don't apologize," she said, shaking her head firmly. "You saved my son from a marriage built on a foundation of lies, in every sense of that word. If anything, our family owes you a debt we can't fully repay." His parents, standing near the head table, looked scandalized. His mother clutched his father's arm, both of them trapped in the middle of a public meltdown about bounced payments and secret mortgages, watching their son's future in-laws implode on what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. "Nathaniel, please, let us explain," my father pleaded, his voice slipping into the smooth, practiced tone he used to calm juries. His tailored suit suddenly looked too big on his deflating frame. "The economy has been difficult for firms like ours. We made some strategic decisions to give Simone the day she deserved. It was out of love. We meant no disrespect to your family. We're still one of the most respected legal names in the Southeast. Our earning potential is enormous. We can recover from this." "Earning potential," I echoed, letting out a laugh sharp enough to cut through his excuses. "Don't make me laugh, Dad. Your earning potential is exactly why I bought this property this morning. I knew your accounts were empty. I knew this payment was going to fail spectacularly. I wanted to be standing right here when it did. I wanted to watch you realize that the daughter you threw into the rain, the one you said would never amount to anything, is now the only thing standing between you and a lawsuit for defrauding this estate." My mother sank to her knees on the polished floor. The great Deborah Bishop, the woman who terrorized junior associates and destroyed my adolescent self-worth, kneeling in spilled wine and the wreckage of her own pride. She covered her face with both hands, sobbing as the full weight of her public collapse set in. Every single person she had ever tried to impress was watching her default on a bill in real time. Her friends would drop her by morning. Her colleagues would whisper about this for years in the halls of every firm in the state. I looked down at her, feeling a strange, undeniable sense of closure settle over me. "You told me I was a disgrace," I said, my voice soft but edged with something final. "You told me I would amount to nothing because I refused to sit in a lecture hall memorizing case law. Look at you now, kneeling on a floor I own, crying over a bill you can't pay in front of the exact people you spent your whole life performing for." I let the silence stretch out before continuing. "But you should know, this is only the beginning of your night." My father's expression shifted from humiliation to something closer to panic. "What is that supposed to mean?" he demanded, his voice rising for the first time. I reached into the small clutch I'd carried in, pulling out a slim black folder I'd been holding on to for exactly this moment. "I've spent the last year building a very thorough picture of how Bishop and Associates actually generates its revenue," I said, opening the folder just enough to let the crowd catch a glimpse of the printed pages inside. "It turns out being cut off from a family gives you an unusual amount of motivation and a very talented team of forensic accountants." My mother's head snapped up, eyes wide with something close to terror. "You have no right," she said, her voice cracking. "Whatever you think you found, it's fabricated. You're vindictive, Amara. You always have been." "I don't need to fabricate anything," I said calmly, turning to the first tab in the folder. "Your own firm's ledgers do that perfectly well." I looked directly at Nathaniel, making sure he heard every word of what came next. 3 years ago, my forensic team noticed something strange in the filings for the Bishop Legacy Foundation, the scholarship fund your family runs for underprivileged law students. The fund was reporting massive annual disbursements, but almost none of that money was ever reaching an actual scholarship recipient. Simone let out a gut-wrenching wail, covering her ears with both hands as if that could physically stop the truth from reaching her. "So we dug deeper," I continued, keeping my tone entirely clinical. "We cross-referenced the Foundation's tax filings with the State Bar's nonprofit registry. What we found is that for the last 8 years, less than 12% of the Foundation's donations ever actually funded a scholarship. The rest was funneled through 3 shell companies registered in Delaware, all controlled by Charles Bishop, all reporting consulting fees for services that were never performed." The reaction from the crowd of judges and senior partners was explosive. A wave of disgust rippled through the room. In legal circles, defrauding a scholarship foundation built to help disadvantaged students wasn't just illegal. It was the kind of scandal that could end an entire firm overnight. "That's impossible," my father said, though his eyes told me he already knew it was true. "The State Bar audits that foundation every single year. They would have caught something like that." "They didn't catch it," I said, pointing a steady finger at my mother, who was still trembling on the floor. "Because Mom made sure they never would. Deborah Bishop, senior partner and board treasurer, personally signed off on every fraudulent disbursement. She used her position on the Foundation's audit committee to bury the discrepancies before the annual review. You worked together. Dad created the shell companies, and Mom used her institutional authority to cover every track." I closed the folder with a sharp, final snap. "There's more," I said, before anyone could recover from that first blow. "The Foundation was only the beginning. It was the easiest thread to pull because it was the one crime that didn't require anyone in this room to actually practice law. The second thread was harder to find because it required going through nearly 400 closed personal injury settlements filed by Bishop and Associates over the last decade. I opened the second tab of the folder, letting the crowd catch a glimpse of spreadsheets and case numbers before I continued. Your firm built its reputation on catastrophic injury litigation, Dad. Car accidents, workplace injuries, medical malpractice, the kind of cases that settle for millions when you have the right expert witnesses lined up. What I found when my team pulled the underlying medical records behind 40 of your largest settlements is that at least 11 of them relied on injury reports signed by a single orthopedic specialist named Dr. Reginald Foss, who has not held an active medical license in the state of Georgia since 2016. A visible ripple moved through the crowd of attorneys, the specific kind of silence that only happens when people who understand exactly how serious a violation is are forced to sit with it in real time. Dr. Foss, I continued, was paid through the same Meridian Consulting Group shell entity used to launder the payment to the bar examiner's wife, to sign fabricated diagnostic reports inflating soft tissue injuries that either did not exist or were vastly overstated. Insurance companies settled those cases for a combined total of over $31 million over 8 years, believing they were negotiating against legitimate medical evidence. Bishop and Associates took a standard 40% contingency fee on every single one of those inflated settlements. That's a lie, my father said, but his voice had lost the commanding resonance it carried only minutes earlier. It came out thin, almost pleading. It's not a lie, Dad. It's insurance fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of medical records. And I handed every one of those case files to the Georgia Insurance Commissioner's Fraud Division, along with the FBI complaint. 3 of the insurance carriers you defrauded have already opened parallel civil suits against the firm. By Monday morning, every case Bishop and Associates has ever settled will be under review. I turned back to the crowd of visibly shaken attorneys and judges who had spent years sending referrals to my father's firm, trusting his name enough to build careers on top of it. You don't run one of the most respected legal dynasties in the Southeast, Nathaniel, I said, my voice echoing with quiet devastation. You almost married into a family of white-collar criminals who were prepared to use your name and your reputation as a shield the moment the authorities came knocking. I didn't lower my voice for what came next. I wanted every syllable to reach every corner of that room. You are not wealthy, I said, the words landing like stones. You are broke, and you are thieves. You spent my entire childhood bragging about the Bishop family legacy. You threw galas acting like the moral conscience of this state's legal community. But the truth is, you built an empire on stolen scholarship money meant for kids who look exactly like I did at 18. Kids who needed that money to become the first lawyer in their family. You took it and used it to buy imported cars and country club memberships and silk dresses. You used it to maintain the illusion that you were untouchable. There was one final piece I hadn't planned to reveal that night, but my father's continued denials pushed me toward it. I opened the third and final tab of the folder. There's a third thing, I said, and I genuinely debated whether to share it here, because unlike the foundation and the settlements, this one doesn't involve stolen money. It involves a gambling debt of just under $400,000 that Dad has been quietly servicing through a private lender in Macau for the last 3 years, using firm assets as informal collateral without informing a single one of his partners. It's the real reason the Foundation's fraud accelerated so sharply over the last 3 years. It wasn't just greed anymore. It was desperation. My father's face went ashen in a way that made even my mother turn to stare at him, her own fury momentarily overtaken by shock at a secret she apparently hadn't known either. "Charles," she said quietly, and for the first time all night, her voice carried something other than performance. "What is she talking about?" He didn't answer her. He simply stood there, mouth slightly open, the architect of the family's carefully constructed image, finally out of arguments, out of excuses, out of anywhere left to hide. My mother rounded on him then, forgetting for a moment that 200 guests were watching, forgetting that I existed at all. 3 years, she hissed. 3 years you let me believe we were building something, that the foundation numbers were simply conservative reporting for tax purposes. While you were bleeding this family dry to cover a gambling habit you never once mentioned to me. "I was going to fix it," my father said weakly, the first genuinely honest thing I'd heard him say all evening. "I had a plan. Once Simone married into the Whitfield name, once we had access to that kind of capital, I was going to quietly pay it all back and no one would ever have to know." "You were going to use our daughter's marriage to cover your debts," my mother said, and something in her voice cracked open. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of horrified recognition, as if she was seeing her husband clearly for the first time in 30 years of marriage. "All of this, everything you've told me for 3 years, was to protect a secret from me too." It was, in its own strange way, the most honest exchange I had ever witnessed between my parents, and it took the complete destruction of everything they'd built for it to happen. A prominent judge near the front row rose from his seat so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I sat on the review committee for that foundation 2 years ago," he said, his voice booming with righteous fury. "You told me personally, Charles, that the fund had grown by 40% under your stewardship." My father opened his mouth, hands trembling, but no sound came out. The polished, commanding managing partner was gone. In his place stood a cornered man realizing the walls had already closed in. "It didn't go to scholarships," I answered for him. "It went into an offshore account. It paid for the very silk your wife is wearing tonight. You are not the moral backbone of this legal community, Dad. You are parasites who drained your own community dry so you could play at royalty." My mother let out a strangled, theatrical gasp, both hands flying to her chest as if she were suddenly struggling to breathe. It was a classic Deborah Bishop maneuver. Whenever she was cornered and losing an argument she couldn't manipulate her way out of, she reached for the role of fragile victim. "My heart," she wheezed, swaying against a nearby pillar. "Charles, call an ambulance. This is causing a cardiac event. I can't breathe." 10 years ago, that performance would have sent me into a panic. I would have apologized, backed down, begged for forgiveness. Tonight, I simply watched with cold amusement. "Don't bother with the paramedics," I said, my voice slicing through her fake medical emergency. "My forensic team also pulled your personal medical records during discovery for a related civil matter. Your heart is in perfect condition. It's your bank accounts flatlining, and your freedom that's about to expire. Save the performance for the federal judge. I'm sure they'll appreciate it at sentencing." My mother's eyes snapped open, all pretense of weakness gone, replaced by a raw hatred that shattered whatever fragile victim routine she'd been performing. The guests around her actually recoiled, taking physical steps back to distance themselves from her. Around the ballroom, phones were coming out of clutches and jacket pockets. The same wealthy guests who had kissed my mother's cheek an hour earlier were now recording every second of her collapse. By morning, This footage would be everywhere. The bishop name was being permanently erased from polite society in real time. "You planned this," my father hissed, his voice dropping into something venomous as the scale of his own destruction finally landed. "You came here today specifically to burn us to the ground. You're a vindictive monster, Amara." "I'm not the monster," I said, laughing without any humor at all. "You threw your own 18-year-old daughter out into a freezing rainstorm because she refused to be a pawn in your legacy. You told everyone I died so you wouldn't have to explain the truth. And you stole from children who needed that money more than you'll ever understand. I didn't create this monster in front of everyone tonight. I just turned the lights on." Simone, still sobbing on the floor, finally lifted her head, her voice raw. "You ruined my life," she choked out, glaring up at me with venomous hatred. "You came here just to ruin my life." "I didn't ruin your life, Simone," I said, keeping my voice steady and devoid of sympathy. "You did that yourself. The moment you decided cheating your way through the bar and marrying for money was easier than building something real." Nathaniel stood absolutely paralyzed, his eyes, which had been full of warmth for the woman he'd been about to marry, now carrying a hollow, exhausted emptiness. He looked down at the black folder in my hands, then slowly shifted his gaze to Simone, weeping on the floor. The woman there no longer looked like the ambitious partner he thought he'd fallen in love with. She looked like a stranger. Nathaniel took the folder from my hands, opened it, and without a word, dropped it directly onto the floor in front of Simone. Pages scattered across the polished wood. Bank statements, forged foundation disbursements, photographed evidence of offshore transfers, spilling out around her like confetti at a funeral. Simone flinched, letting out a broken whimper as the proof of her family's crimes scattered across her rented gown. "I've spent my entire career trying to build something that actually helps people," Nathaniel said, his voice trembling with cold, controlled fury that commanded the entire room. "I sacrificed sleep, relationships, my own health, trying to bring clean energy to communities that have been ignored for decades. And your family stole from children trying to become lawyers, just so you could buy a bigger car." He reached up, ripped the white boutonniere from his lapel with a sharp, violent motion, and threw it onto the pile of scattered evidence. He planted his dress shoe directly on top of it and crushed it into the floor. "This wedding is over," he announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Do not call me. Do not contact my parents. My legal team will be in touch to sever any financial ties to your family." Simone let out a blood-curdling scream, grasping at the fabric of his trousers. "Nathaniel, please, you can't leave me like this. I'll fix it. I'll give up my license. Just don't walk away." He kicked his leg free, backing away from her with open revulsion. My father lunged forward, attempting to grab his shoulder. "Nathaniel, wait! We can contain this. The Bar Association doesn't need to know. We can sign an NDA." Nathaniel swatted his hand away like he was batting away something diseased.
"If you touch me again, my family's legal team will bury you before the state bar even gets the chance. You disgust me. All of you disgust me."
He turned his back on his weeping ex-fiancée and walked toward his own parents, who were already gathering their things, faces pale with shock at the family of criminals they had almost merged with. But before Nathaniel could reach the exit, before any of them could slip quietly out into the Napa night, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall burst open from the outside with enough force to crack against the walls. The wealthy guests gasped and scrambled backward, knocking over champagne flutes and floral centerpieces in their haste to clear a path. A wave of federal agents flooded into the pristine reception, moving with swift, tactical precision, fanning out across the room to secure every exit. The stark navy of their jackets, bright yellow letters spelling FBI across the back, shattered whatever elegant illusion remained of the evening. Behind them walked several officials wearing badges from the Department of Justice and the State Bar's Ethics Enforcement Division. The lead agent, a tall woman with an expression that suggested she had absolutely no patience left for wealthy people's excuses, marched straight down the center aisle, bypassing the terrified guests, until she stopped directly in front of my trembling family. "Deborah Bishop, Charles Bishop, and Simone Bishop," she announced, her voice landing like a final verdict across the silent hall. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, embezzlement of charitable funds, and obstruction of a state bar investigation. Place your hands behind your backs." My mother let out a shrill, hysterical scream, scrambling backward on her hands and knees, her emerald gown tangling around her legs. "No, you cannot do this. I am a senior partner at one of the most respected firms in this state. You are making a terrible mistake. I demand to call my attorney." "You can call whoever you want from holding, Mother," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through her protests as I stepped forward, walking calmly past the federal agents. I didn't need to raise my voice. The confidence in my tone carried the whole room's attention anyway. I looked down at her, now backed against a catering table, shaking like a cornered animal. "They aren't making a mistake," I continued. "I submitted that exact folder to the regional director of the FBI and the State Bar's Ethics Division 48 hours ago. Bank statements, forged foundation disbursements, the shell company filings, all of it, with my name attached as the whistleblower." Simone stopped crying long enough to stare at me, jaw hanging open in pure horror. "You called the FBI 2 days ago. You knew they were coming." "Of course I knew," I said, letting a genuine, relaxed smile spread across my face, one that sent a visible shiver down my sister's spine. "I coordinated the timing with them myself. They were ready to make the arrests yesterday morning, but I asked them to wait. I wanted Simone to have the chance to put on her rented dress. I wanted Mother to wear her best jewelry. I wanted every judge and senior partner she'd ever tried to impress gathered in one room before you were dragged out in handcuffs." I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to my mother's. "I wanted the whole thing to be the most spectacular public collapse this city has ever witnessed." "You are a demon," my father whispered, staring at me with hollow, defeated eyes as 2 federal agents grabbed his arms and forced him around. "No, Dad," I replied, standing tall as they pulled his arms behind his back. "I am just the consequence of your own choices. You spent your entire life stepping on the vulnerable to elevate yourself. Now you get to feel what it's like to hit the ground." The sharp, mechanical click of handcuffs echoed through the ballroom, cold and rhythmic. Click. My father was secured, his face pressed against a marble pillar as agents patted him down. Click. My mother screamed obscenities, thrashing as an agent locked cuffs around her wrists, ignoring every demand for special treatment. Click. Simone sobbed uncontrollably, hands bound behind her back over the delicate lace of her ruined rental gown. The lead agent began reading them their rights, the cold, familiar legal language cutting through the sound of my mother's continuous wailing. My Aunt Patrice, my father's younger sister, who had spent years quietly enabling my parents' version of events, whispering to relatives at every holiday gathering that I had simply chosen a difficult path, rather than acknowledging the truth of what had actually happened, stood frozen near the dessert table, her hand pressed over her mouth. She had been one of the loudest voices insisting at my supposed memorial luncheon a decade earlier that I had always been troubled, that my death was somehow a tragic but unsurprising conclusion to a difficult life. Watching her face as the agents read my parents their rights, I felt no satisfaction in her shock, only a distant, clarifying confirmation of exactly how much of my family's mythology had depended on everyone around them agreeing not to look too closely. The wealthy guests, the exact circle of judges and senior partners my parents had spent their entire lives worshiping, watched in absolute silence. No one stepped forward to offer a lawyer. No one defended them. The people my parents had sacrificed my childhood to impress were actively recording their arrests on their phones, treating the whole thing like a spectacle on the side of the road. I stood perfectly still in the center of it all. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest for 10 years finally, completely evaporated. I watched the federal agents march the Bishop legal dynasty out through the same grand doors I had walked through less than an hour earlier. Stripped of their titles, stripped of their wealth, stripped of every last shred of manufactured dignity. Just 3 people being paraded toward a line of federal vehicles, their flashing red and blue lights cutting through the soft California dusk. Simone tripped over the hem of her rented dress on the gravel path outside, scraping her knees. She screamed my name, begging for a bailout that would never come, her voice swallowed by the slam of a car door. I stood on the wide stone steps of the estate and watched the motorcade pull away down the winding vineyard road. Behind me, the guests who moments earlier had been sipping champagne under my family's name were now practically trampling each other to reach the valet stand, frantically deleting phone numbers, instructing their assistants to erase any photo evidence connecting them to the Bishop charities. I watched one senior partner physically block a photographer from a local society page, shouting that he had never actually been close with the Bishop family, despite having posted a photo from their anniversary party not 4 months earlier, with a caption calling my father his brother from another mother. Marlene Ashworth, the judge who had recognized me earlier in the evening, approached me quietly near the valet stand as the crowd thinned. She didn't offer congratulations, and she didn't offer condolences either. She simply studied my face for a long moment, the way I imagined she studied witnesses from the bench for 30 years, and said, "I sat on the review committee that fast-tracked your sister's exam appeal. I want you to know I had no idea what it actually was at the time. I signed off on a recommendation from a colleague I trusted. I will be resigning from the bar's disciplinary board first thing Monday morning, and I will be cooperating fully with whatever investigation follows." I told her I appreciated her honesty, and I meant it. Not everyone in that room was guilty of anything beyond trusting people who didn't deserve it. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to. The social execution was total. I took a slow breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs. The chaos of that ballroom faded slowly, replaced eventually by the quiet calm of my penthouse office overlooking the San Francisco Bay. Morning light spilled across the wide oak floors, warm and steady, and I traced the rim of a porcelain teacup, feeling entirely grounded for the first time in longer than I could remember. The suffocating weight of my family's expectations was finally, completely gone. The months between the arrest and the trial felt strange in a way I hadn't expected. I had spent so long imagining the moment of exposure that I had never really planned for what came after. The long, grinding machinery of federal prosecution, the depositions, the endless motions filed by increasingly desperate defense attorneys trying to find any procedural crack to exploit. I was subpoenaed as the government's primary whistleblower witness, which meant I spent the better part of a year working directly with an assistant U.S. attorney named Renata Cho, a sharp, unflappable woman who reminded me a little of the person I had become. We spent hours in a windowless conference room in downtown San Francisco, walking through the wire transfer records line by line, making sure every dollar could be traced back to its source with a clarity no defense attorney could puncture. "They're going to try to paint you as a vengeful daughter with a grudge," Renata told me during one of our early sessions, tapping a pen against a stack of exhibits. "Juries like a redemption story, but they're suspicious of revenge. We need every piece of this to stand on its own, independent of how you feel about your family." She was right. When the trial finally began in a federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta, the defense strategy was exactly what she predicted. My father's attorney, a smooth, silver-haired litigator who had once been my father's own mentor, spent his opening statement painting me as a bitter, estranged daughter who had spent a decade plotting an elaborate act of revenge disguised as justice. "The government wants you to believe this is a case about fraud," he told the jury, pacing slowly in front of the box. "But at its heart, this is a case about a woman who never forgave her family for a difficult parenting decision and who used her considerable resources to manufacture a public spectacle designed to destroy them." I sat in the gallery on the second day, watching Renata calmly dismantle that narrative piece by piece. She didn't argue with the idea that I was angry. She simply let the documents speak. Wire transfer records showing money moving from the Bishop Legacy Foundation into 3 Delaware shell companies, none of which had employees, offices, or any operational footprints beyond a mailing address at a UPS store outside Savannah. Tax filings showing consulting fees paid to those companies for services no one could describe under oath. The most damning moment of the entire trial came on the 4th day, when the foundation's former bookkeeper, a soft-spoken woman named Carol Deniston, who had worked for my parents for 11 years, took the stand for the prosecution. She testified that she had raised concerns about the disbursement pattern 3 separate times over the years, and that each time, my mother had personally instructed her to reclassify the entries and never mention it again. "She told me," Carol said, her voice trembling slightly, "that questioning the family's finances was not part of my job description, and that if I ever raised it with the board again, I would be finding new employment by the end of the week." I watched my mother's face during that testimony. She sat perfectly still at the defense table, jaw tight, staring at a spot on the table in front of her, refusing to meet Carol's eyes even once. My father took the stand on the 6th day, and, true to form, he tried to charm the jury the way he'd charmed juries for 30 years. He spoke slowly, deliberately, framing the shell companies as an unfortunate but legal tax structuring decision that had simply been mischaracterized by an estranged daughter with an axe to grind. But under cross-examination, Renata walked him methodically through 6 years of emails between him and the shell company's registered agent, emails discussing specific dollar amounts to transfer each quarter based on how much the foundation had raised that year, always calibrated to stay just under the threshold that would trigger a deeper state audit. By the time she finished, his composed, practiced calm had visibly cracked. He stumbled over dates. He contradicted himself twice about when the shell companies were originally established. The jury, 12 strangers who had no personal stake in my family's collapse, watched him unravel in real time. My mother's testimony was, in many ways, worse. She wept through most of it, insisting she had simply trusted my father's financial decisions and had no independent knowledge of where the money actually went, despite being the foundation's board treasurer and the sole signatory on 4 of the shell company accounts. When Renata produced an email in which my mother personally negotiated a lower consulting fee with one of the shell companies to preserve more margin for what she called personal discretionary use, the courtroom went completely silent. The most emotional day of the trial, at least for me, came when the prosecution called 3 former scholarship applicants to testify about how the fraud had affected their lives. A young woman named Ijeoma Achibi, who had applied for the Bishop Legacy Scholarship twice and been rejected both times despite near-perfect grades and a recommendation letter from her state senator, described sitting in her car outside her community college, crying after the second rejection letter, wondering what she had done wrong to be passed over twice by a foundation specifically built to help students like her. "I found out later," she told the jury, her voice cracking, "that the year I was rejected, the foundation reported its highest fundraising total in its history. I used to tell people I just wasn't good enough. I spent years believing that. It never occurred to me that the money was never actually going anywhere close to where it was supposed to go." A second witness, a young man named Marcus Delaney, no relation to my father despite the shared first name, testified that he had taken out over $60,000 in private loans to finish law school after being rejected for a scholarship the foundation's own website claimed was fully funded that year. He was, at the time of the trial, still paying off that debt, working as a public defender in a county that could barely afford to pay him a living wage. A third witness, an older woman named Rosalind Pete, who had applied for a smaller emergency grant through the foundation years earlier, described how the rejection had forced her to withdraw from her final semester of paralegal school entirely, taking a factory job instead to support her 2 children. She never went back to finish the program. "I think about it sometimes," she told the jury quietly. "What my life would look like if that money had actually gone where it was supposed to go. I'll never know now. That's the part that's hardest to sit with." I sat in the gallery through both testimonies, watching my mother's face carefully. For the first time since the arrest, I saw something in her expression that looked almost like genuine shame. Not the practiced theatrical kind she performed when she was cornered, but something quieter and more real. It didn't change anything. It didn't undo 8 years of stolen scholarships or the students who never became the lawyers they could have been. But it told me that somewhere, underneath all the performance, she understood exactly what she had done. And that understanding had simply never been enough to stop her while she was still capable of stopping. Closing arguments took place on a Thursday, and I made sure to be sitting in the gallery for every minute of it. My father's attorney tried one last time to salvage some version of sympathy from the jury, arguing that Charles Bishop was a man who had made serious errors in judgment under enormous financial pressure, but that decades of genuine community service, pro bono cases, mentorship of young Black attorneys coming up through the ranks deserved to be weighed against those errors. Renata's closing was different. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform outrage the way television dramas taught people to expect from prosecutors. She simply walked the jury back through the timeline one final time, methodically, almost gently, letting the documents do what documents always do better than any theatrical flourish ever could. Watching her work that courtroom, I found myself thinking about how different her version of quiet authority was from the version I grew up around. My parents had always confused volume with power, certainty with correctness, performance with substance. Renata proved something I had already learned in building my own career, that the steadiest, most convincing case in the room is rarely the loudest one. It is simply the one built entirely out of things that are actually true. The defense wants you to weigh decades of reputation against 8 years of documented theft, she told the jury, standing very still in front of the box. But reputation is not evidence. Reputation is exactly the tool these defendants used to make sure no one looked closely enough to find the theft in the first place. Every gala, every donation, every carefully cultivated relationship with this state's legal community functioned as camouflage. The question in front of you is not whether Charles and Deborah Bishop did good things during their careers. The question is whether the government has proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that they also committed the specific federal crimes charged in this indictment. The financial records answer that question definitively, and no amount of reputation can unhappen a wire transfer. I watched several jurors nodding slowly as she spoke, the kind of quiet, involuntary agreement that tells you a case has already been won before the verdict is officially read. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts against my parents. I remember the specific silence in that courtroom when the verdict was read. The way my mother's shoulders dropped. The way my father stared straight ahead at the federal seal on the wall behind the judge's bench, as if refusing to look at anyone might somehow make the moment less real. Simone's trial was separated from my parents due to the distinct nature of the bar examiner bribery charges, but it happened only 2 months later in the same courthouse. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she had been unaware the payments to the examiner's wife constituted anything illegal, that she believed it was simply a personal loan between family friends. That argument collapsed the moment the prosecution introduced a text message exchange between Simone and the examiner, discussing exactly how much money would guarantee a hand review of her failing exam score, sent 4 days before the payment was wired. Facing decades behind bars, my family did precisely what people like them always do when cornered. They turned on each other. My father took the stand and claimed my mother had orchestrated the entire foundation scheme from the beginning, using her position on the board to hide every discrepancy. My mother wept in front of the jury, insisting my father had threatened to end their marriage if she didn't cooperate with the shell companies. Simone tried to throw both of them under the bus, claiming she'd had no idea the bar examiner's involvement in her exam constituted a federal offense, that she was simply a victim of enormous family pressure. The federal judge was entirely unmoved by any of it. The Department of Justice made an example of them. My mother and Simone were permanently disbarred. Their names were splashed across national news outlets as the faces of nonprofit fraud and academic corruption. Every asset they owned, the vacation properties, the offshore accounts, the mansion I'd once been locked out of in the rain, was seized to pay restitution to the scholarship students they'd defrauded for nearly a decade. The sentencing hearing took place on a gray morning in early spring, almost exactly a year after the wedding. The courtroom was packed, not with the judges and senior partners who had once filled my family's galas, but with reporters, former scholarship applicants, and a handful of insurance company representatives eager to see the final chapter play out in person. The judge allowed victim impact statements before handing down sentences, and I watched as Ijeoma Achebe, the young woman who had been rejected twice for the scholarship she deserved, stood up and read a statement she had clearly rewritten many times. She talked about the community college classes she'd taken instead of the law school she'd been accepted into, about the extra 3 years it took her to finally become a paralegal because she couldn't afford tuition without the funding the foundation was supposed to provide. "I'm not here for revenge," she told the judge, her voice steady despite the tremor underneath it. "I'm here because I want it on the record that real people were behind every one of those stolen dollars. Real futures delayed or destroyed so that a family could buy a nicer car." I gave a statement of my own, though I had debated for weeks whether to say anything at all. I kept it brief. I told the court that I wasn't asking for a particular sentence, that the law would decide what was proportional to the crimes committed, but that I wanted the record to reflect something I thought mattered beyond the dollar figures and shell companies. I said that the same instinct that let my parents defraud a scholarship fund for a decade was the exact instinct that let them throw an 18-year-old daughter into the rain for refusing to be useful to their image, and that both were symptoms of the same fundamental sickness, an inability to see other people, even their own children, as anything other than instruments for their own advancement. My father received 17 years in federal prison. My mother received 14. Simone was sentenced to 9 years for her role in the bribery scheme involving the state bar examiner, who was separately disbarred and convicted alongside her. The great Bishop legal dynasty, once one of the most respected names in Southeast litigation, was reduced to a cautionary tale whispered about in law school orientation lectures for years afterward. Before the agents had even finished loading my family into the vehicles waiting outside, Nathaniel found me standing near the edge of the vineyard, staring out at the rows of grapevines, catching the last of the daylight. He didn't say anything for a while. He just stood beside me, hands in his pockets, watching the same darkening hills. "I don't know whether to thank you or apologize to you," he finally said. "I almost married into that. I spent 2 years building relationships with your parents, trusting your father's advice on structuring my company's board, and none of it was real." "You don't owe me an apology," I told him. "You didn't know. That's exactly how they built everything, by making sure the people closest to them never had enough information to see the whole picture." "Still," he said, "I'm sorry you had to sit in a room and listen to them talk about you like you were nothing, for years, while quietly building something bigger than any of us realized." We stood there for a long time in silence, and something about that moment, the utter absence of performance, of anyone trying to manage an image, felt like the first honest conversation I'd had at a family event in my entire life, even though we weren't family at all. "For what it's worth," he added quietly, before turning to walk back toward his own shaken parents, "I think the version of you that grew up in that house would be proud of the woman standing here right now. I only met you a few hours ago, and even I can see that clearly." I didn't have a response ready for that. I simply nodded, and I stood alone a while longer at the edge of the vineyard, watching the last of the daylight disappear over the hills, saying nothing else, because for the first time in 10 years, nothing else needed to be said. Nathaniel emerged from the wreckage with his reputation completely intact. He cooperated fully with federal investigators and publicly distanced himself from the entire Bishop family. Once the legal dust settled, Vantage Peak Capital finalized a larger, expanded investment into Solvia's next-generation battery facility. Without the toxic interference of my family hovering nearby, Nathaniel was able to focus entirely on scaling clean energy infrastructure across 3 states. We built a strictly professional, deeply respectful business partnership. He is a brilliant engineer and an honorable man, and I will always be grateful that his instinct that night was to protect me, instead of believing the version of me my family had spent 10 years constructing. In a strange twist of fate, it was Nathaniel who eventually introduced me to his longtime general counsel, a quiet, sharp-witted attorney named Julian, who had none of the performative arrogance I'd grown up surrounded by, and all of the warmth I'd spent my entire life searching for without knowing it. That man is now my fiancé. We are planning a small wedding on the Sonoma coast next spring. There will be no judges to impress, no forced networking with senior partners hoping for a favor. Just the people who actually love us without conditions. Almost exactly a year after the wedding, a national business magazine ran a cover feature on Vantage Peak Capital, timed to coincide with the firm crossing $2 billion in assets under management. The reporter who wrote it, a woman named Priscilla Ndiaye, who had covered venture capital for over a decade, asked me during our final interview whether I worried the scandal would define the public perception of my career going forward, whether investors would always associate my name with the viral video before they associated it with my track record. I told her the truth. I told her that for the first 30 years of my life, my name had been defined entirely by other people's expectations. First my family's, then, in a strange, twisted way, the internet's expectations of what a redemption story was supposed to look like. I told her the only thing I actually cared about was whether the founders I funded built things that mattered, whether the capital I deployed actually changed outcomes for people who needed it to. Everything else, the headlines, the viral clips, the endless comment sections analyzing my facial expressions and grainy cell phone footage, was noise I had decided a long time ago not to let define me. The article ran with the headline, "The Investor Who Built an Empire in Silence, Then Broke It Open in Public." And for the first time since the video went viral, I felt like a piece of coverage had actually captured something true about who I was, rather than simply repackaging the most dramatic 30 seconds of a very long decade. The news coverage in the weeks after the wedding was relentless in a way I hadn't fully prepared myself for. A guest's video of the arrest, shaky cell phone footage capturing my mother screaming on her knees in spilled wine, went viral within 48 hours, racking up tens of millions of views under captions like, "Prestigious law family arrested at daughter's wedding," and "Georgia legal dynasty collapses in real time." Legal commentary channels dissected the footage frame by frame. A well-known true crime podcast dedicated an entire 3-part series to what they called the Bishop Foundation scandal, interviewing former scholarship applicants who had been rejected years earlier under mysterious circumstances. Applicants who, it turned out, had been quietly deprioritized so more of the foundation's funding could be diverted without drawing attention. One of those former applicants, a young man named Devante, who had wanted to become the first lawyer in his family, reached out to me directly after recognizing my name in an early news report. He told me he'd been denied a scholarship the same year the foundation reported record fundraising numbers, and that the rejection had derailed his plans to attend law school entirely. He ended up working 2 jobs to pay for a smaller state school instead. I quietly funded a new scholarship in his name through Vantage Peak Capital's philanthropic arm. Not for publicity, not for redemption, but because it felt like the only way to put something clean back into a space my family had spent years contaminating. I testified before a state legislative committee that spring, one convened specifically to review oversight gaps in nonprofit foundation auditing after our case exposed just how easily a family with the right institutional credibility could manipulate the system for nearly a decade without detection. It was strange, sitting in that hearing room, answering questions from state senators about audit thresholds and board governance, knowing that 10 years earlier, those same institutions would not have taken a single phone call from me. Simone's sentencing hearing happened separately from our parents, on a bright, unseasonably warm morning that felt almost cruel, given what the day actually held. I sat 3 rows behind her defense table, close enough to see her hands trembling as the judge reviewed the sentencing guidelines out loud. She had lost weight in the months since the wedding, her cheekbones sharper, her once flawless hair pulled back into a plain, unstyled ponytail that made her look almost unrecognizable from the golden child who had screamed at me across a ballroom less than a year earlier. When the judge asked if she wished to address the court before sentencing, Simone stood slowly, gripping the edge of the table. Her voice, when it finally came, was smaller than I had ever heard it. "I spent my whole life being told I was the successful one," she said, staring somewhere past the judge, past the gallery, past all of us. "I built my entire identity on being better than my sister, because that was the only currency my parents ever rewarded. When I realized I couldn't actually earn the career I was pretending to have, I didn't know how to stop pretending. I didn't know how to just be an ordinary person who needed to work harder or try a different path. Ordinary was never allowed in our house. I'm not asking the court for leniency because I don't think I deserve it less than my parents do. I just want it said out loud, at least once, that I understand exactly what I destroyed. And it wasn't only my career." I don't know if the judge factored that statement into the final sentence at all. Federal guidelines leave very little room for a moment of genuine remorse to move the needle. But I noticed something shift in Simone's face after she said it. Something that looked almost like relief. The specific relief of finally saying a true thing out loud after a lifetime of performing a version of yourself designed for other people's approval. Simone wrote me a letter from prison about 8 months into her sentence. I almost didn't open it. Part of me expected another performance, another attempt to manipulate her way back into my good graces, the way she'd manipulated everyone else her entire life. But the letter, when I finally read it late one night, was different than I expected. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask me to intervene with her sentence. She simply wrote that she had spent most of her time in a cell finally understanding what it felt like to be discarded by people who were supposed to protect you, and that she was sorry, genuinely sorry, for the years she'd spent making sure I felt that same discarding every single day of my adolescence. I didn't write back right away. I sat with it for weeks, unsure of what I even wanted to say. Eventually, I sent a short reply. Not forgiveness exactly, because I'm not sure forgiveness is something I owe automatically, just because someone finally feels the consequences of their own choices, but an acknowledgement. I told her I hoped she used the rest of her sentence to actually become someone different. Not for my sake, not for redemption in the public eye, but because the alternative was spending the rest of her life exactly as hollow as she'd been standing in that ballroom. My mother has never written. My father sent one letter early on, full of legal justifications and half apologies that read more like a closing argument than an actual reckoning with what he'd done. I haven't responded, and I don't think I will. Some relationships end not with a single dramatic conversation, but with the slow, quiet realization that there was never enough real love there to rebuild, only the performance of a family that looked impressive from the outside. I met Julian for the first time about 4 months after the wedding collapsed, at a small dinner Nathaniel organized to formally close out the expanded investment paperwork for Solvia's new facility. Julian had been Nathaniel's general counsel for almost 6 years by then. Quiet in a way that read as confidence rather than shyness, the kind of person who listened fully to a question before answering, instead of performing an answer he'd already decided on halfway through hearing it. He didn't know who I was beyond the investor who had saved his client's company, and for the first hour of that dinner, he had no idea about the scandal that had made national news only months earlier. When he eventually put the pieces together, watching my face carefully as he realized exactly which viral video he was thinking of, he didn't ask me a single invasive question. He simply said, "That sounds like it took an extraordinary amount of patience to plan," and changed the subject to ask what I actually enjoyed doing outside of work, a question almost no one in my life had ever bothered asking me. We started slowly. Coffee after contract negotiations that ran long. a hiking trail near his apartment that he swore had the best sunset view in the Bay Area, which turned out to be true. He never once tried to impress me with money or status, largely because he had grown up solidly middle class in Oakland, the son of a public school teacher and a union electrician, and had built his own legal career one case at a time without a single inherited advantage. Being around him felt like exhaling after holding my breath for a decade. Julian and I got engaged on a rainy Tuesday in November, in the kind of quiet, unglamorous moment that felt like the opposite of everything my family had ever valued. We were sitting on the floor of my apartment eating takeout out of the containers because neither of us wanted to deal with dishes, and he simply reached into his jacket pocket and asked, no elaborate setup, no audience, no orchestra playing in the background. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. He asked me once, gently, whether I regretted how things unfolded that night in the vineyard, whether some part of me wished I had handled the truth more quietly, spared everyone the public spectacle. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I told him no. I told him that for 18 years, my family had used privacy and reputation as a weapon, hiding every ugly truth behind polished dinner parties and galas and the assumption that no one would ever dare question the Bishop name. The only language they had ever truly respected was public consequence, because private consequence had never once slowed them down. If I had confronted them quietly, in some private room with no witnesses, they would have found a way to spin it, to bury it, to protect the image at any cost, the same way they had buried a scholarship fund meant for children exactly like the one I used to be. I look out over the skyline some mornings and feel a strange, profound sense of closure. For 18 years, my parents tried to convince me I was fundamentally broken. They called me the failure, the disgrace. They told me that without a law degree, I would be nothing but a burden begging on the street. But the truth is, I was the only person in that entire family who never had to lie, cheat, or steal to build something of my own. I was the only one clean enough to walk into the light. I think about the version of me that stood on that porch in the rain more often than I probably should. I don't think about her with pity anymore. I think about her the way you think about someone you owe a great deal to, because she was the one who made the decision, at 18 years old, with $40 in her pocket and nowhere to sleep, that she would rather build a life from nothing than spend one more day shrinking herself to fit inside a family that only had room for one daughter at a time. I have had people ask me since all of this became public whether I feel guilty, whether some part of me wishes I had simply let Simone have her wedding, let my parents keep their reputation, and quietly walked away with my own success intact. I understand why people ask that. We are taught, especially as women, especially as Black women, to believe that keeping the peace is always the more dignified choice, that airing a family's dirty laundry in public makes you the difficult one, no matter how much dirt was actually buried underneath the laundry to begin with. I don't feel guilty. I feel something closer to relief. The specific relief of finally putting down a weight I didn't even realize I had been carrying every single day for 10 years. There is a very particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the only person who knows the truth about a family everyone else believes is admirable. I carried that exhaustion quietly for a decade. And the moment I finally set it down, in front of 200 witnesses, in a ballroom I owned, I understood exactly why I had waited so long to do it the right way instead of the easy way. There is a specific kind of loneliness in being the person who knows the truth long before anyone else is ready to hear it. For 10 years, I carried around the knowledge of exactly who my family really was, while the rest of the world admired a version of them that had never actually existed. That kind of loneliness teaches you something valuable, even though you would never choose it voluntarily. It teaches you that your own perception of reality is allowed to be correct, even when everyone around you insists otherwise. It teaches you patience, the kind that lets you wait a full decade for the right moment, instead of burning everything down out of impatience the first year you had the means to do it. And it teaches you, eventually, that the people who benefit most from your silence are rarely the people who deserve it. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. The people who are the loudest about your shortcomings are almost never actually concerned about your success. They are concerned about what your success means for the story they've built about themselves, the one where they were always right, where their harshness was always justified, where the family hierarchy they constructed was always fair. When you finally outgrow the role they assigned you, it doesn't threaten your relationship with them. It threatens their entire self-image, and that is a much harder thing for most people to survive intact. When toxic people try to convince you that you are worthless, it is rarely about your actual flaws. It is almost always about their own terrifying insecurity. They try to shrink you because they are mortified by how powerful you might become the moment you stop believing them. They use rejection and humiliation as weapons to keep you small and dependent on their approval. But you never have to accept the value that broken people assign to you. No one has the right to price your worth using their own corrupted standards. If you find yourself surrounded by people who treat your ambition like a joke, who isolate you or try to shrink you down to something manageable, do not waste your breath arguing with them. Do not scream. Do not beg for their validation. Walk away. Protect your peace. Use the pain of their rejection as fuel to build your own table. Work in silence. Let them believe you are failing. Let them believe they broke you. Dedicate yourself entirely to your craft, your goals, and your own healing. Because there is no argument more powerful than undeniable results. I want to say one more thing directly to whoever is still watching this, because I know some of you found this video at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, carrying the exact same weight I carried out of that house 10 years ago. Some of you are sitting in a room right now with people who share your blood, but not your values. People who call it love when they criticize everything you build. People who tell you that your dreams are unrealistic. In the same breath, they tell you they only want what's best for you. I need you to hear this clearly. Those two things cannot both be true. Real love does not require you to shrink. Real love does not need you to fail in order to feel comfortable. I am not telling you to burn every bridge the way I did. Your situation is not mine, and revenge, however satisfying it looked in that ballroom, was never actually the point. The point was truth. The point was refusing, after a decade of silence, to let people who hurt me continue building a life on a foundation of lies about who I was and what I deserved. If your path to peace looks like distance instead of confrontation, if it looks like quiet healing instead of a public reckoning, that is not weakness. That is wisdom, and it is yours to choose. What I can promise you, from the other side of everything that happened in that vineyard, is that the version of you they wrote off, the version they called lazy or difficult or not enough, is not the final draft. You get to write what comes after the chapter where they gave up on you. Some of the most powerful people I have ever met in business built their entire careers out of the wreckage of someone else's low expectations. I am one of them. You can be too. Build your empire while they are busy building their illusions. And when the time is right, let your success be the loudest, quietest slap they will ever feel. If this story meant something to you, if any part of it felt like your own life reflected back at you, tell me where you're watching from one more time in the comments below. Share it with someone who needs to hear tonight that walking away from people who diminish you is not betrayal, it is survival. And if you believe, the way I do, that the best revenge is simply becoming someone they can no longer touch, hit subscribe, because this is far from the only story like mine, and I promise you, it will not be the last one I tell.